Let's go back in time to when Heavensward was still the main expansion for Final Fantasy XIV. Towards the end of this expansion cycle, a new boss was created called Zervan. The normal version was simple enough, but the extreme version was quite controversial. On the first hour of release, Zervan was already mutilated and gutted by multiple world first grading groups, who already had the hardest of contents, Savage, gripped by the throat. So dealing with Zervan Extreme, which was designed to be a step below Savage, was simple child's play. Then you have the simply hardcore groups that, while probably not as dedicated as world first groups, were most likely just as skilled and defeated them with ease as well. Plenty of these hardcore groups also consist of voices in the community, including players that regularly stream and have their opinions parroted. These words of wisdom are then utilized by midcore groups and then the general player base as a whole. Imagine being part of this time, where the majority of experiences these hardcore groups have are completely different from your average group, to the point where a casual group will see a completely different set of mechanics, because they didn't meet the damage threshold that hardcore groups can make in their sleep. I personally don't need to imagine it, because I've been there. Skip, soar, or disband was a mantra that highlighted the disparity between the hardcore and the average Joe. To understand the differences, one would need to understand how this all started. While Zervan Extreme brought it entirely to light, it wasn't the first instance where this was a problem. Something as simple as stat allocation for tanks had different philosophies back when the game first started. Back then, there was 30 bonus stats you could distribute among your stats. And for most classes, there was an obvious stat to dump into, your damage stat. For tanks, it was much more controversial. Without getting too deep in this tangent, tanks could either increase vitality to increase their maximum HP, or increase strength to increase damage. At this point, the arguments are fairly predictable. The average Joe would say, I'm a tank, and surviving is the point of my role, therefore I get vitality. The hardcore player, however, would say, strength gives me more threat, increases kill speed since tank's damage is not meaningless in this game, and the extra HP that vitality gives is unnecessary as long as I use the tools my job and my teammates provide. Of course, the hardcore player is more thorough with his thought process than the average Joe, and that's actually the point, because to be frank, the hardcore player thinks about the mechanics and numbers in this game far more than the average Joe does. And on top of that, the hardcore player is correct. Increasing the tank's strength stat did become part of the general meta, to the point where the dev team had to change up how damage from tanks was calculated and apply strength to accessories because tanks began to actively ignore raid gear designed for their role, because the extra HP simply wasn't necessary. But let's get back on track. If I had to pick where I personally felt the disparity began, it'd be when Heavensward first came out with the introduction of Alexander Gordius. Sure, there's always been different strategies before that, but A Realm Reborn was when everyone was actually pretty terrible at the game. Some were just less terrible than others. It wasn't until Yoshi P and the dev team made it their goal to make difficult content that the hardcore players truly began to stand out, because by making Savage so hard, it caused discontent and even alienated the general player base. To put it in perspective, the majority of raid groups couldn't even make it past the very first mini-boss of Gordius called Faust. And this was so disheartening that many groups simply gave up and went on with their business. Hardcore players, on the other hand, relished in this content and continued on, and through progressing this content, their skills increased in ways that would not be attained anywhere else. Concepts like boss positioning to increase total boss uptime, cost opportunity with healer GCDs, and lining up damage buffs to make burst windows that much more powerful were fully established through these times. However, such optimization is only ever required in Savage content. So when you're participating in extreme content or even below that, hardcore players can often run into the average Joe who simply want to beat the fight. And when these two types of players who think on fundamentally different levels come out ahead, it can often get pretty ugly. So, raise your hand if you ever met this type of player before. This player joins the party and is actually very good, if not just plain great. He has really high DPS and does his job flawlessly. However, he complains about party performance quite openly, to the point where his teammates are uncomfortable or even worse, begin to feel bad about their play. This is a generalization of a hardcore player, and while some of these aspects are true, they're often exaggerated. This happens on the other side of the coin too, however. Casual players are often seen as players who simply don't care about their performance at all, even to the detriment of their party, and when called out on their mistakes, they'll often deflect or argue in return. As a person who has played a lot and has experienced nearly all settings, I can confidently say these extremes very rarely happen, but as said before, certain aspects of them do in fact exist. Currently, and seemingly in the distant future, we're in a meta where DPS means everything in a fight. It sort of became your defining trait, so hardcore players often shape their strategies with this in mind. Let's focus on something very simple for an example, where the boss is facing. So for the average Drow player, it's pretty simple. Unless the mechanic demands for something different, the boss always faces north. This is because whenever you start a fight, the party is automatically starting south, and getting close to the boss causes them to get aggressive. So it makes sense for the tank to grab the boss and face him the other way, so DPS can perform their duties without worrying about anything like a cleave. It also makes more sense to ask one person to do something instead of 7 people to do something, as it leads to less chance of someone making a mistake. Lastly, and perhaps more importantly, it's a standard that everyone accepts, so facing the boss north is pretty much the safest thing a tank can do. Now for a hardcore player, this can be much more complicated. For instance, is there any mechanics that causes the boss to change direction automatically? There's been a fair amount of bosses such as Zermon and Omega who start facing south for special abilities, and thus melee DPS would begin dealing less damage as they would fail to get their bonus damage from positionals. So it makes sense to face the boss north at the start of the fight, and then face the boss south as soon as the opportunity arises. Another thing hardcore groups think about is ad spawns. Let's imagine the boss is facing north, and an ad spawns south. A co-tank will need to grab this ad before it goes crazy on the party. But if the boss is faced south, the current tank that is mitigating the boss can also grab this ad and tank them both at the same time. Or perhaps the boss causes so much movement that it's simply better for the tank to just not care about facing it anywhere in particular and have the rest of the party adjust to it like another boss mechanic to lessen confusion. The rabbit hole can go pretty deep like this, and this is just about where to face the boss. So let's move on. So I'm sure this so far has seemed like I've more or less been saying hardcore players have the better strategies. Well, to dispel all doubt, yes, this is the case, and it's only natural that they do. However, it may not be the best for party finder groups. The average Drow is concerned about 2 things. What do I need to do to complete the trial? And what does this group of 7 strangers expect me to do? 7 strangers should be highly stressed here, because this is why party finder groups have standard strategies across all trials. If party finder groups had to explain strategies every time that they came together for a trial, it could take forever to get stuff done. This is why video guides hold so much weight in the community, because being able to learn a standard strategy that all groups will be able to follow is a strong advantage, especially if you're not playing a new content within the first week and those strategies have already been passed through around the player base. And these strategies have one major thing in mind: safety. The strategies prepared typically have a larger margin of error and is made to help the general player base get together to perform adequately well within the trial. So when a hardcore player steps in and say, "My strategy is better," it's usually true, but it is only better if it can be executed well. Asking the average Joe to learn a new strategy that isn't standard comes with a learning curve, and therefore an opportunity cost. If the hardcore strategy requires significantly more party coordination, it is typically not worth it for the average Joe to learn this. Some would even say it's a waste of time, especially when that time can be used clearing the content instead. It's tough for the hardcore player base to sprinkle their optimized strategy into the general player base, because the hardcore are vastly outnumbered, and to be frank, the hardcore tend to thrive in their own bubble. While they are not typically exclusionary, the hardcore often expect too much too fast. Being a good player does not always mean you are a good teacher. Which leads me to my final thought. The reason why I made this discussion is because with Shadowbringers out and injecting new life into the game, Final Fantasy XIV has reached numbers never seen before. Will these numbers drop? Certainly. But I am actually very confident that the lull between this expansion and the next will have much more active numbers. Part of this is because the Twitch community is actually thriving at the moment. And who are at the front for this? Hardcore players and guide makers. Captivation of the streamer aside, it shows a general interest in high-level play. And while the Twitch community is quite small in comparison to the perhaps millions of players with Final Fantasy XIV, it often just takes one group or even just one person to make an everlasting change to a meta. So can hardcore strategy become standard? Yes. Will it happen? That's hard to say. I personally feel improvement is a metric to how much you enjoy something. The better you are at something, the more passionate you are. It's how I've always enjoyed my hobbies. But I'm not everyone, and I'm not going to fool myself into thinking people enjoy the same things I do. So it's really hard to say. Part of this would also have to assume more and more people will get into Savage and dedicate themselves to clearing it, because it's hard for a new player to see clear improvement without being pushed to do it. The dev team may have to increase their skill for these hardcore strategies to sprinkle down, and this is something that would never happen. So will it happen? I honestly can't say, but I will say these should never be forced into the general player base either. Final Fantasy XIV thrives on its accessibility, and while I have my own personal gripes about this, that's a perfectly fine philosophy to thrive for. So what do you think? Should we be mimicking hardcore players more? Or are things fine the way they are?